Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karen Messina and Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America, a special series of the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karen Messina, your host, along with my co-host, Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams. In this series, we discuss the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis, those that might help us understand the persistence and dynamics of racism in the United States. We'll be talking with analysts, and particularly Black analysts, to help us comprehend and combat racism. I hope you enjoy and learn something from this series as we do each time we do it. So today our topic is cancel culture and what it means to forget and also be forgotten. We'll be talking about this topic and how and when it emerges and how it has emerged in recent years and how it's been illustrated in some of the actions that the current administration has taken. At least that's the way it can appear. So, Felicia, why don't you start the discussion by describing cancel culture as you know it today, and also how it emerged?
Of course, Karen. Thank you for such a lovely introduction for today's episode. When we think about cancel culture, what we need to take in is that as we know it today, it does have roots in Black culture, and also particularly within the realm of Black Twitter. And it emerged as a tool for marginalized communities to call perceived injustices and hold powerful figures accountable. So, in keeping with that thought, it's also important to add on to that the concept of cancel culture, it gained a prominence alongside of hashtag movements. You know, when we start thinking about social media and the hashtag Me Too, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Girl Magic, there's all of these particular ways in which it's gained some of its prominence within social media, and it's helped to spread, really the action and language of cancel culture even further. So it'll be really important for us to take that time and look at that today.
Well, thank you. That's very informative. I'm going to take a look at something that's happened recently in our country, and that's the erasure of Black, Indigenous, and women's military histories at Arlington Cemetery. This has been in the news a lot in this particular.
It has.
Yeah, it has, and probably all places in the country, I hope, anyway. And what it means to cancel part of our culture. That's what's happening. So in the middle of March, just a recap for people who aren't familiar with us or know the details, in the middle of March, as part of the revisited DEI directive brought by the White House, Arlington Cemetery's website scrubbed various aspects of notable graves, and that's a quote that's been in many papers, of dozens of biographies of figures such as General Colin Powell, the members of the Tuskegee Airmen, and also there were parts of it that were scrubbed. This is the website that included grave sites that highlighted specific efforts of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and selected women service members who are buried on the grounds. And yet, what had previously been there, lists, maps, lesson plans on the website, they were removed. This is according to Forbes magazine. So I'll start out with that, and maybe you can give us some specific information about that. And I have a little story I want to read from a teacher.
Oh, and before you read that story, I want to add another piece to it as well, is that there were erased heroes, just like Jackie Robinson, and just really, these moments of when these heroes, these particular individuals, like you mentioned with Colin Powell, and then all of a sudden there was an immediate return to, oh no, that was just an era on one's part. And so they have been added back. So this whole idea of having the power to cancel, but then revive, and how we may think about that also in the consulting room. There's still a lot more, even with the Department of Defense and some of the actions that have been taken with military profiles. And as you've talked about, just being removed from the website altogether, that can be quite concerning, but then how it trickles down into one's psyche, and how those that we may treat may come in and hold that type of experience within themselves as it's being projected from societal issues.
Yeah. Well, also, just in terms of the website, there was public outcry, and some of the information has been returned, but not all of it, not in the state that it was in.
Exactly.
And there's one particular person who I'd like to talk about, because I was really struck by an article I read. This story is about a teacher in Tennessee, and it was NBC News. It was about a teacher who previously, for several years, had taught about the Navy hero Doris Miller to her students. And he was a cook on a ship. He was gunned down attacking Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor in 1941. This happened before he led other soldiers to safety. So he was the first Black sailor to receive the Navy Cross for Valor. And his images was actually used on recruitment posters. But earlier this year, the teacher went back to the website, getting ready to teach her students again, and she found that it was taken down, and she was extremely upset about that, as were her students. So that piece that she used to teach is no longer there. Now, the Pentagon press secretary told NBC News earlier in the week that DIN is dead at the Defense Department. This is a quote. Discriminatory equity ideology is a form of woke cultural Marxism that has no place in our military. It divides the force, erodes unit cohesion, and interferes with the service's core warfighting mission. So the backgrounds that documented thousands of web pages of military history have been scrubbed from the Pentagon website. And with that sort of statement, I mean, it sort of goes hand in hand with that sort of statement. So I just wanted to read that piece and just add that Navajo code talkers were also erased, and women were, various women, certain women of color were as well. So I think that's important.
It's very important.
Maybe.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. Maybe you can tell us your sense of how cancel culture affects us, affects the person who's canceled. I mean, we can imagine, but.
Thanks for that question. This phenomena can be defined, in different ways, but one way to consider is it's more so where is that individual or even that entity is thrust out of the social and professional circles, or places within in our own society. I think that it's important for us to keep in mind that even through the practice, it describes, cancel culture describes, just the existence that tends to create this element of threat and discomfort within individuals. But also in looking at discomfort and threat, we have to keep in mind that even throughout history, this has existed and that it's been criticized. It's been criticized as a form of injustice. It's been criticized in ways in which we have to keep in mind that fear is really a way in which it's been utilized in canceling people out. That it creates this fear base in which one may take in that they can be attacked or they can be annihilated at any time, which therefore reduces any ability of trust and sense of security or even reliability within oneself or any external object or experience that a person may have. So these are ways in which it can be, it can affect an individual, but just the whole idea that, canceling out and how a person participates in that type of action, and that type of mindset of canceling out. And even the gestures, it could be very subtle. It could be very subtle in ways in which one may not really comprehend how they're participating. And so subtle within these very small microaggressions that we've talked about in previous episodes of our podcast. But, those are some of the ways for sure in which it can affect an individual and it can affect a group. Just like what we're starting off with, how we now have this group, not only of African Americans, others of color, but even gender, when we start talking about women, can be reduced to not exist and not be valued. And again, that big piece of fear that comes in that you can be annihilated in some way, not just socially, but in the minds of others.
Right. And one thing I would like to talk about the impact just briefly on mental health, but I do want to say that Dr. Powell-Williams and I are experts in this area. We're not just speculating about something. We're going to talk about mechanisms of defense. In this case, we're talking about things that have been written in newspapers, magazines, and that we've heard people say on television. So this isn't just something that we're speculating about. And psychoanalysts do really have an obligation to warn the public about things in an informed way. So we're going to be talking a little bit later about mechanisms of defense and how it appears to us that these particular defenses are at play. You can decide for yourselves what you think. But on the topic of the impact of mental health, I mean, there's really no way to escape how somebody would be, if somebody is canceled, how public shaming would come into
That's right.
it's just inherent with being canceled. It's just on a much, much less egregious scale. If you're canceled from a invitation list and, you've always been included in somebody's get together and all of a sudden you're canceled from the list, that doesn't feel very good. But when your whole being or what you did for your whole life is canceled, that that trumps, pun intended, probably, being canceled from a party, but it can certainly make someone feel intensely shameful, and it exacerbates loneliness and anxiety and depression, just for starters. So, what about the consulting room, our offices, Felicia? What do you think is happening there when it comes to being?
Ah. Well, I think it's really important for us to just consider some of the transferences that come up within those sessions with our patients and what gets projected, from their own experience with their own feelings. And so, and keeping in mind cancel culture at that point, for example, you know, the fear that the analysts, the fear that the therapist will cancel them out. And in a sense, let's say, for example, when we're looking at various topics, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, even age, disabilities, things of that nature. But those things come into our consulting rooms, and oftentimes there is a fear that as analysts we won't hear, we won't be able to take that in, and that there will be a shaming, as you so mentioned, from us with our patients. And so there's all of the projections that they bring in that we have to be mindful of, and being mindful of that within ourselves, because we do carry things that do at moments really affect how we think and what we hear and what we take in. So that piece is really important. Their own fear and their own uncertainty that annihilation will happen within the consulting room. And for us to be mindful within those transferences that come in, our own countertransference, and even some of the possibilities of reenactments that will be, utilized, in the dyad, the analytic dyad, that we need to take into consideration and really be mindful of.
That's a very good point, or very good points that you've made. Oh, so maybe we could move on to defense mechanisms. And in this category, Dr. Powell-Williams and I will be talking about what it appears to be to us. We have not analyzed the people who have been involved with cancel culture in this particular period of time. But we can talk about what defense mechanisms we think are at play.
Mm-hmm.
And one that's kind of, it's not on the usual list of defense mechanisms, is erasure.
Mm.
If you're as a defense mechanism, why do you suppose that happens, Felicia, that somebody is erased? A threat?
Mm. Oh, definitely. 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 It's erased as a threat, and the erasers, feeling threatened and afraid. Difference, as much as it can be embraced and celebrated, can also be weaponized and used against a whole other group. And when one person feels threatened by difference, a clear way of doing that is erasing and removing altogether.
Yeah. Just as a sidebar, it reminds me of all the Kennedy papers that have been released lately.
Oh, and not only the Kennedy papers, but even Martin Luther King's assassination.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it was suppressed, repressed for a reason. And now that it's coming out, it's quite telling. But that's a topic for another day. It is about the defense mechanism. Return of the Repressed is interesting. Maybe you could talk about that, but I'll just say that when figures have to erase, push somebody aside, suppress, really, because that's done, although it's called Return of the Repressed. It could be unconscious, but suppression is generally a conscious action.
Mm-hmm.
But when somebody does that, it doesn't go away. And I think that it's generally thought that it only makes the problem worse, and it makes public outcry louder and media attention stronger.
Well, I think what you're also saying, or at least what comes to mind for me, is that with erasing, I go back to that it makes the wound even more visible. It's more public.
Yeah.
But if we were to think more about, the return of the repressed, again, as you mentioned, that whole public outcry and how the media's attention just represents the return, of that whole racial history. And, what what I love is how it comes up in the arts, just like Spike Lee wearing, Jackie Robinson's jersey on Instagram, and other ways in which it comes up, and what we tend to carry with us and make sure that what one tries to erase, what one tries to repress, that there is within that upcry a visibility of what that is, and so it could be wearing of something, it can be speaking to, it can be listening to music, it can be not only um oh, Karen, a way in which film will take such precedence and making sure that we stay in a place to see the relevance of our own history, and that our history isn't isolated to one group, but our history involves a diversity of many different layers and threads that come together to make, you know, to make us who we are, as a group, as a country, as human beings. So when I think about that, especially repressed, that comes to mind for me. And also in a way in which it brings forth an element of truth,
Yeah.
that we have to look at the reality of what's really there. And that can be very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And that may be where projection as a defense comes into the picture.
I think so.
With projection, there is something about a person that they can't tolerate, so they project it onto others. It's very common in our society, as is projective identification. Now, that's when the recipient of the projection starts to believe what the person is saying, no matter how off base it may be. But we're not talking about projective identification here. It's just projection of one's own flaws and behaviors that are not, well, say, not stand-up behaviors, but it's much easier to say it's that person who possesses the feelings or thoughts or behaviors. It's not me. I read a book one time. It's not me, it's you.
Uh-huh.
How narcissists use projective identification to be what they want. And it's unusual for a psychoanalyst, but it also was a self-help book and said what you can do about it. So anyway, it's not me, it's you. That's projection. And there's also something akin to it, but it's displacement. And it occurs when feelings of, say, anger or frustration are redirected from the original source to a more acceptable target. So it sounds very similar, and it actually is pretty similar. In this case, cancel culture may provide an outlet for individuals to express pent-up frustrations with societal issues by focusing on specific individuals or entities that they can scapegoat. So again, it's pretty much in the same camp in this case. What about
Definitely.
defense mechanisms, Felicia? Can you?
I'm thinking about rationalization. After you making that comment, I just I love the self-help book. It's not me, it's you. Did I get the title right, Karen?
That's right.
Ah, yeah, that we have to talk about that at one point. But when thinking about rationalization, I think about how that also plays into, the whole cancel culture component, and it participates in such a way to where it just really justifies, you know, the actions of so many as necessary for social justice, or accountability, and even the consequences or just the disproportionate way of how one perceives the offense. And this allows the individual to maintain a positive self-image, while engaging in potentially harmful behavior. And so just being able, as we kind of throw this around a lot, oh, I'm just kind of rationalizing it, but a way in which a person tries to take this in to make sense of it, as if it's what they're choosing, has some relevance, some validity to it.
Right.
And so I think that that plays a very big part in as a defense mechanism in cancel culture. But also there's other perspectives to this that we can keep in mind as well, from a psychoanalytic standpoint. And cancel culture can be understood as a collective defense itself, against anxiety and unresolved conflicts. So these are things that we do need to hold on to and think about when we are sitting with this whole topic of cancel culture.
That's a very important point. In that, there has been some research lately that suggests that cancel culture can have a positive effect on marginalized groups. Now, that sounds counter to what we've been saying. But if you think about it, if people come together and they understand what's happening to them, there is a sense of community that can emerge from that. So that it's not just you. It's people who aren't willing to um, familiarize themselves with your culture or your race or your gender, and they just push you out of the group. Well, if you band together, there can be something that's comforting about that, and there can be feelings of validation in a community. So I think that's important to point out. It's better not to have it, but if you do, that is something that is maybe comforting is a better word than
Oh,
positive.
and it strengthens the thread, and some of those positive effects. It goes back to as we were beginning to talk about defense mechanisms, and looking at even Spike Lee wearing Jackie Robinson's jersey. So faceted, even into Black girl magic, Black history. And we haven't talked about that being canceled out. That Black history was being canceled out in all federal buildings or federal, institutions. The removal of Black Lives Matter Avenue, removing of all of those things as if that's being
Yeah.
canceled out. So we think about that, and one may say, well, what does that have to do with psychoanalysis or what happens in the consulting room? It brings in much of what we're talking about with how one will identify not only in their own experience with themselves, but also in how that gets woven into even archaic or previous relationships, or even the relationship that may get played out in the transfers between the patient and the analyst. And so it can be utilized in a way in which it can strengthen, certain groups. It could strengthen the analytic process. It could strengthen groups in regards to, especially African American community within churches and community centers, where there has always been a way in which groups will come together and rally and strengthen that cord. Yeah, and then you have women who come together, women who are saying that their voice is powerful, and all of those particular pieces that matter. What matters is not only being a woman, but having the power to make decisions for oneself, one's body, one's medical care. Those things enter into our consulting rooms, and they enter very powerfully. And how we have to sit with that, whether we're sitting with the rationalizations, the projections, we're sitting with the displacements, all of those things tend to trickle in, and they can be ignited into, a powerful emotion. But then also, it can create, as we mentioned before, especially you, Karen, the shame, the anger, the fear. So I lend that to our listeners as well as we continue talking about this.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on something I said earlier, that it can be empowering if people come together. They don't feel alone in being canceled. It can give them a voice. But it doesn't happen with everyone, of course. So silencing is another problem because that's its aim. Its aim is to silence voices that people find offensive. So some people who don't come together with other people can feel silenced, and that can feel pretty awful. And one thing that we have now that that didn't happen X number of years ago, maybe before 2012, is that we now have like public humiliation, public cancellation, so to speak, amplified by social media. It can really feel like a very intrusive attack on one's psyche when people read about all this, they read about themselves. It could be filled with distress, emotional stress and trauma. It could be traumatizing.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, and also, again, I fall back to the fear. When we start talking about cancel culture, where we have to keep in mind with these particular groups, there are others that are in the group who are so afraid of speaking out.
Right.
So when you mention silencing, what happens if they speak out against what they may recognize as an injustice, as a canceling, as an eraser? What happens? And so they silence themselves out of their fear of whatever they may imagine, whatever it is that they're fantasizing about could happen to them, whether they're going to be canceled, whether they're going to be annihilated in whatever way they imagine that. So again, you have that silence because there's this need to preserve oneself. There's a need to make sure that one is safe, and then we go back to a rationalization of making such a decision of that and not speaking out and remaining silent.
Absolutely. So maybe we can, I have a thought and maybe you can add to it. What remains is my question. They have to just scrub these stories. I don't believe it's about neutrality for 1 second or being merit-based. I think it's about power, control over the narrative, and who gets remembered. Because nobody's asking these people whether they want to erase part of their histories. It's being done to them.
Oh, yes, yes.
On a
Very good point, Karen.
Yeah. So what does it mean for that? And who benefits from silence?
Mm.
Powerful?
I think it's twofold. And we've been talking about that, during this time. Yeah, the powerful, for sure. But then let's look at this. It gives one group power. If we were to just take the word power, what's you have one group who benefits from the silence, and it feels very powerful for them because they feel as if they have the authority to make a decision. But then you have the other group who is feeling othered, who is feeling erased and canceled. But in their silence, there may be for some within the group a preservation, a way in which to preserve and protect. But at the end, that silence, you know, does it really hold as much power as one might think? But I could see it as twofold.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's another thing that just came to my mind that I've been thinking about as I've read all the things that have happened in Arlington, and that's the Signal, the app, the Signal debacle, where so many members of the cabinet and a few other people were talking about attacks on Yemen with specific details. Now, that doesn't seem to be on the road to being canceled. It seems to be that that's okay. So it seems to be a double standard here. And we're canceling people who we might not want to be part of history, but something that's really quite egregious. I have read that it could be a violation of the Espionage Act, that people are talking about national security issues on a non-secure app. Seems quite egregious to me, and so far, now we don't know what will happen going forward, but so far, there doesn't seem to be anything that's being done about that. So it's quite curious.
Yeah, but Karen, let's go back to the beginning of that. Here's this information that is being discussed, on a non-secure site. But then our thoughts and feelings, the reality of all of that was being canceled. Like, no, this never happened. Why would you think that this happened? This is not real. And so there is this whole idea of this group who really wanted to cancel out our own thoughts, the own realities that actually existed in front of our eyes. So it takes us all the way back to the beginning of this podcast, that there are these, real, in real time moments that are trying to be removed from one's own consciousness to benefit another group and their need to have power. And so that also is something that we have to keep in mind as analysts as we are working with our patients. That there is sometimes this way in which we're seen as this powerful entity within this dyad, and how we carefully have to be mindful of the analytic listening, and not intruding or assessing or making these moments, with our patients in such a way to where we're taking on and exuding this element of power to where we silence our own patients.
I think that's an excellent idea for the consulting room. But you and I, as citizens, I don't think are going to let this Signal app situation be silenced because
No,
we all know it happened.
we know it happened.
We know it happened. So, as public voices and citizens of this country, that part we're not going to we're not going to allow that to be silenced in whatever.
We
keep it
The
alive.
the uprising of the fact that, we have our own mind
Right.
and that we can see and hear for ourselves and that we don't need to be guided in this way of being told what's real and what's
Right. We know that. We've lived in a democracy for too long. But hard back, another story, but we have lived in one previously.
got it.
And hopefully in decades to come.
That's right. Well said, Karen.
Yeah. Well, we'll be back next month with another podcast about this topic. And we hope that this was interesting. And I'm sure people will have a lot to say about it.
Yes, and please, comment and share with us. We would love to hear from you.
Okay. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.